Henry Ford had this famous line that if the American people ever figured out how banking really works, there'd be a revolution tomorrow. People don't understand how banking really works. People seem to think the money is already there and that banks are simply lending it to people. Of course, banks create money by making loans, and that's a great secret of banking. And over the course of the last 30 years, for example, here in the United States, the profitability of manufacturing has plummeted to the point where only about 15% of the profits being made in America by the corporate sector come from the manufacturing sector, and most of those are financed because it's, for example, in the car industry, they're not making any money off the manufacturing of cars, they're making all their money off the financing of cars. So, and how do they do it? They do it directly through the government giving them a legal structure whereby they can extract all this money. And I think people are starting to figure this out. I mean, you know, capitalism in the classic sense of the term is supposed to be about manufacturing and marketing things. They're not even getting most of their money from that anymore. They're just taking it directly from us through their alliance with the government, which they effectively bribe, since our American political system is essentially a system of institutionalized bribery at this point. So that the banks actually write the legislation that's supposed to regulate them and pay off the politicians to pass the bills. And that legislation thus gives them the right to simply appropriate more and more money directly from people. As a result, I mean, I think that's why you see this great outpouring of cynicism about politicians and cynicism about the overarching structures of finance in particular. Wall Street and the government have become the same thing. What we need to do is we need to think about what that really means democratically. If money is just a promise, a series of promises that we make to one another, well, if democracy is to mean anything, it means everyone has to be in on that process of what promises we make, what promises we keep, what promises we have to renegotiate when circumstances change. Why should the promise that a politician makes to their constituencies be considered made to be broken, but the promise that same government makes to bondholders be considered absolutely sacred? Now, obviously people will say, all right, I mean, if you say that people can just break their promises that default on debts, then nobody will make loans, people will be less likely to make loans, and the economy will be threatened. Yes, that's true, but if politicians regularly break their promises to constituents, then people won't vote and democracy will be threatened, which of course is precisely what happens, isn't it? No one seems to think that's a terrible crisis, or nearly as terrible crisis as what would happen if people occasionally defaulted on their bonds.
When we asked Onka what he'd do if Perrow didn't one day return the mocker, Onka said he'd take him behind a bush and slit his throat. But even if he did lose his investment, he could never lose the glory of having given it.
I find it very interesting that if you look at history, the vast majority of rebellions, peasant rebellions, for example, have not been over issues of slavery, serfdom, caste, normal forms of oppression that rural people face on a day-to-day basis. They're almost always about debt. The first thing that peasant rebels do when they come into a town is they start burning the debt records, whatever they might be, wiping the slates clean. After that, they go after the land registers, and after that, maybe the taxes. It's always the debts first. Now, so that's what's fascinating about it, really, because on the one hand, debt is the most powerful ideology ever discovered to make people on the bottom feel that somehow they deserved it, they did something wrong. But every now and then it explodes. And I think that's exactly what we're witnessing now. On the one hand, people seem to accept it. On the other hand, they reach a certain point where they say, now, wait a minute, who owes what to who? And I think one reason why it explodes like that is because, unlike slavery, unlike serfdom, it's based on an initial premise of equality. That is to say, if you tell somebody, I'm a lord, I'm superior, you're inferior, well, you're not going to like that very much. But it's not quite as insulting as if you say, well, actually, we're all equals here. This is a free contract, except you messed up. You're obviously inadequate. You should be my equal, but you failed. If you use that logic, well, eventually it does reach a point where people become very indignant. And since the initial premise of equality is there, from the perspective of power, that's kind of the worm of the bud. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing people reaching the point where the whole thing becomes ridiculous, and they're saying, well, wait, we are all just making promises to one another. We're all equals here, ultimately. This isn't a fair contract.
And what change do you have in mind if we want to have a better, brighter future?
Well, I think we need to move much more towards what I call co-op capitalism, which is essentially reconnecting capitalism and the economy with social justice. It's about revaluing the importance of relationships within society, whether within business, but within society as a whole. It's about valuing public goods explicitly again. Forests, parks, public spaces become valued not just because they're worth something as assets, but because they contribute to a sense of social cohesion. And it's about, co-op capitalism is about recognising that the old narrative that competition was the only way for companies to succeed and grow isn't necessarily right, and that cooperation and collaboration actually are very well-suited business models for our times. There's a lot of research now on cooperative businesses. In the Netherlands, of course, you have Rabobank, would be an example of a cooperative business. The research is really quite compelling that over the financial crisis, all over the world, cooperative businesses have been outperforming traditional businesses significantly in terms of growth, in terms of not having to lay off employees. We see a whole host of collaborative businesses on the internet and models, whether it's crowdsourced models like Wikipedia, whether it's sites like couchsurfing.com, where people come together and trade places to stay. I mean, we're just seeing all of these different types of models emerge, which are doing well, which are better than the old models and are embracing a kind of cooperative ethos. So I think it's a moment where we can look forward and think, actually, not just for ethical reasons, but actually, if we want to do best as a country globally, it's time to start imbuing and adopting more and more cooperative values into this next phase of capitalism.
A little debt can be good.
A little debt can be good, or even a great deal of debt if it's contained within a larger moral structure.
So we can't live without debt.
In a certain way, I think in a society where you have impersonal social relations, something like that will occur. The question is whether it is contained in larger structures of morality which are such that do not need violence to enforce, or whether they pervade everything and end up justifying extraordinarily coercive social relations, which is what I think is occurring now.
And on a personal level, would it be a good idea to, say, return to the advice that my parents gave and say, well, for me, I can't control what governments do or big businesses do, but on a personal level, I can say, I'm not going to spend any more than I have. Is that would that be a good rule of thumb?
Well, I think there is a lot to be said for living within one's means, but I think there is an amount of debt one can take on and still be living within one's means.
And how would you know what that amount is?
So, I think if you wanted to buy a place to live and you wanted to take out a mortgage, and you knew how much money you were earning, and you could reasonably expect that you would continue to be earning this money for a number of years, and you took on a percentage of that and you thought it through, then that would be a rational acceptable decision. And you'd be investing in your future by having a house as well. So, I mean, I think those are situations where maybe your parents were a bit too strict.
Right.
Ini orang ini. Anak orang ini pakai